So tonight we're going to talk about the days of creation in Genesis chapter 1. Obviously, when you're dealing with the beginning of the Bible, that would make it a very important subject, right? But then the question becomes, well, what do you do with those creation days? There are obviously a lot of different people who interpret those days very differently. What do we do with that information? Is it a bunch of hopeless contradictions? Is there any hope of preserving any kind of literal interpretation? Or do we just have to say, it's just all made up, it's all mythological, it's all figurative or symbolic or whatever? So what we're going to talk about today is how to try to preserve a literal interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. And of course, what I mean by that is not to say that we're trying to use eisegesis and read a literal interpretation into the text. What I'm saying is that we want to try to figure out, if the text is meant to be understood literally, is there a way to understand it literally? Because obviously, option number one here, the young earth view, young earth creationists believe that there is a very literal way to understand Genesis chapter 1 in a completely literal sense without any kind of symbolism or analogy at all. But then, is that also possible with an old earth view as well? So that's sort of the scope of what we're going to cover tonight. And I think that you'll be kind of surprised at the level of detail that gets involved in this argument. And believe me when I tell you, we're still only scratching the surface tonight, even though what we are going to talk about tonight is going to be is going to be much more detailed than what you're used to hearing. Much more detailed than probably what you've heard at the average Bible study, where everybody just sits around and tries to come up with their own thing, And I think we've all been in groups like that before. But no, today we're going to take a serious look at the text. But we are going to talk about these 10 views. And the thing about these 10 views is that they interpret the text literally. So these 10 views are the young earth view, the day-age view, the gap view, the framework view, the analogical days view, the intermittent days view, the limited creation view, the revelatory days view, the cosmic temple view, and the prophetic days view. Now, only one of these is a young earth view, which is obviously number one, the young earth view. The rest are old earth views, or they are open-ended. They don't necessarily confine you to young or old earth. It could be either of them. But obviously, the people who hold these views are probably looking to reconcile science with the Bible as well. So they're probably going to prefer an old earth view, but not always, not necessarily. And I'll tell you what that looks like when we get there. And another thing, too, if you have any familiarity with this topic, it's possible that you've heard some of these views called by different names before, which is fine. But the thing is a lot of the people who advocate for some of these views, they will call them by different names, but the names are not specific enough to be able to tell what we're talking about. So for the purposes of tonight, we should call them by these names here because, like, for example, some of them call their views the historical view. It's like, well, we're all aiming for a historical view, so that doesn't really tell us exactly what's being said. So yeah. So we're going to talk about each of these 10 views, some of their strengths and some of their weaknesses. And I'm also going to take you on kind of a tour through Genesis chapter 1 as well to show you why there are different ways to look at it. Because a lot of people, when they read an English translation, they think to themselves, how could you possibly interpret this any other way? And the reason is because it wasn't originally written in English. So we'll talk about that a little more. Also, of course, I do hold to a particular one of these views. I hold to the prophetic days view, which I'll talk about last. I hold to the prophetic days view, which is the view that my dad advocates for in his book, Genesis, Science, and the Beginning. Dad published this book in 2018, and it was the result of 30 years of research and dialogue about Genesis chapter 1. He poured his heart and soul into this book. And my dad, when he first became a Christian, when he was in college, he was a young earth creationist. He was a very staunch young earth creationist. And he read all the young earth creationist books. He knew all of their arguments and all of their science and all of their exegesis and everything. But then he started reading books by Hugh Ross, who is sort of a modern popularizer of old earth creationism, particularly the day age view. And so my dad ended up sort of converting, as it were, to old earth creationism in the same vein as Hugh Ross with the day age view. But after a while, my dad came to disagree with the day age view for certain reasons and opted instead for the prophetic days view. And of course, I will explain what all of that terminology means as we go along tonight. So if you are interested in this topic more, I definitely recommend getting my dad's book. You can get it off of Amazon. It's available for Kindle, I believe, and it's also available on the Whitfenstock Publishers website. But the book's pretty easy to find if you just Google it. I will say that, my dad would be much better at presenting this topic than me because he had all of this information just ready at the front of his mind, and it was really incredible the information that he could summon on this subject. If he was talking about this tonight, you wouldn't be going home until tomorrow morning because he would just keep talking. But I really miss that. But I'm going to do my best tonight to represent what he argued for in this book as best as I understand it. And I do think that I understand it pretty well. All right, so why are there so many views of Genesis 1? Again, you read the English translations and you're like, why would somebody have a different understanding of what this is supposed to mean? Well, part of it is the Bible's relationship to science, because not everybody thinks that the Bible would be scientifically accurate. Some people think that it would have to be scientifically accurate, otherwise God is like a liar or something. But other people say, no, God is free to use symbolism and analogies and metaphors as much as he likes. He's not confined to have to use scientific terminology or anything that would be scientifically literal. So that's part of it. It's this question of, would Genesis chapter 1 be scientifically accurate? Would God be interested in that sort of thing? Well, that's not a question that we have a whole lot of access to. We're not inside of God's mind in that sense. So we just have to do the best that we can with the text. And of course, depending on how you view modern day science, you might want to think that the earth is old, or you might want to think that the earth is young. So given those two factors, you automatically have three different combos here. The earth is young and the Bible would be scientifically accurate, or the earth is old and the Bible would be scientifically inaccurate, or the earth is old and the Bible would be scientifically accurate. I've never heard anyone argue that the earth is young and the Bible would be scientifically inaccurate. I'm sure they're probably out there somewhere, but I have a feeling they are probably novices when it comes to this topic. They're probably just trying to be different. I could be wrong, but that's my impression. And another thing that a lot of people don't consider too is that something that doesn't occur to a lot of people is that your view of Genesis chapter 1 is very closely related to your view of divine inspiration of the scriptures. In other words, we believe that the Bible is the Word of God, but how does that work? How does God inspire somebody to write scripture? But we don't know exactly who wrote Genesis, which is my point here. The origins of Genesis itself are mysterious. Now, it is tradition that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. However, most scholars agree that Genesis chapters 1 through 11, which is everything from creation through the Tower of Babel up to the story of Abraham, most likely pre-existed Moses in some form or another, either as an oral tradition or perhaps as a cuneiform tradition, perhaps as a hieroglyph tradition in some way. The Hebrews did live in Egypt for 400 years. So it's not exactly, we don't exactly know who originally put these stories together, even though we can be fairly certain that Moses is probably the one who at least tacked them on to his Genesis chapters 12 through 50. And he probably, of course, translated them into Hebrew. But then we don't know what languages they would have come from before that. I mean, it seems like it would have had to have been Assyrian or Egyptian or something like that, but we just don't know. We don't have any archaeological data that tells us what it would have been. So the origins of Genesis are just mysterious. And you're fine to believe that Moses wrote it. That's fine. But even then, you have to contend with the fact that the story is older than Moses. So, either way, the story ends up being somewhat anachronistic. In fact, we know that Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are anachronistic to some extent because the names assigned to a lot of the places in Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are contemporary with Abraham. But of course, they wouldn't have been called by those names before that time, right? It had to get up to that time. So for example, Eden, that's an anachronistic name. That was a name that they used in Hebrew from that time period going forward. So that wouldn't have been the actual literal name going all the way back to the Garden of Eden. So stuff like that is what makes this entire subject confusing, because we just don't know where the beginning began. And besides all of that, there are just nuances in the Hebrew text that most lay people just overlook because they're not used to looking at the Hebrew. They don't read the footnotes in their Bibles. They don't take note that, some Bibles have words in italics, which means that they're not in the original language. They're just added for clarity in English. A lot of people overlook that. So there are nuances in the text that a lot of people overlook. And that is what produces these different views of Genesis, is just that there are different ways to look at it. I will say, though, that not every view that I'm going to cover tonight is created equally. Some of them are a little odd, and I won't have as much to say about them. But the reason why these top 10 are standouts is because they're the ones that have been dealt with the most in the scholarly literature, not because they're everyone's favorites, although everyone's favorites are in there for sure. All right, so now this is really important. What do these 10 views all have in common? And this is really important because no matter which one of these views that you believe, these 5 things are all in there. These 5 things are not going to change with all of these views. These 5 things are: God is the creator of the entire universe. God specially created humanity in his image. Adam and Eve were historical figures. Mankind sinned against God, and the punishment for sin is death. Those are the essential doctrines that come from Genesis chapters 1 through 11, or at least Genesis chapters 1 through 3. None of those things are going to change with any of these views that I'm going to talk about tonight. All of these things are literally true. The only one that might be affected a little bit is the idea that Adam and Eve were historical figures. Some of the views that we'll discuss tonight do not require that Adam and Eve were historical figures, but they would allow for them. They would allow for them to be historical figures, just depending on how you would come to that conclusion, which is not really the subject tonight. Our subject tonight is not whether or not Adam and Eve were historical figures, but just know that none of the views tonight stand in contradiction to that. Many of them are open to it, and some of them do require it. So that is not going to change with any of these views. All right, so let's take a brief look at these first verses in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. So the evening and the morning were the first day. All right, those are the first 5 verses of the entire Bible. For the record, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, is one of the most unanimous translations in all Bible translations. Basically, every Bible translates that verse exactly the same way. It's very clear. But immediately in verse 2, it starts to get very unclear. What does it mean that the earth was without form and void, and that there's darkness over the face of the deep? What exactly is going on there? What do those words mean? Does this mean that the earth was not a sphere? Does it mean that the land was not formed? Does it mean that there was absolutely nothing there at all? Was there an earth even there at all? Had God created it yet? These are the sorts of things that come into question. I'm going to give you some commentary along the way for these verses as we go, just so you can see why these 10 different views are being dealt with in the way that they are. So first things first, this word beginning, which in Hebrew is the word Reshith, it can refer to a moment in time, but it usually refers to a period of time. So in other words, you could use it to say that, let's say, you're at the beginning of a race. You're at the starting line, right? So it's a very specific spot. It's one spot, and just say time has not begun yet. You're at the beginning. But most of the time in the Hebrew text throughout the Old Testament, the word is used to refer to a period of time toward the beginning. So it's not at the beginning, it's in the beginning. And you can see this in verses like Jeremiah 28:1, where it says, at the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 4th year and in the 5th month. So in other words, it's not at the very beginning of Zedekiah's reign, like as in on the day that he became king. It's in the 4th year and the 5th month of his kingship. So it doesn't have to mean that it's a moment, it's one moment of time at the very beginning. It can be a block of time in the beginning. So a lot of people are willing to admit this. It's like the beginning is a block of time, it's not a moment of time, which means that verse 1 is not necessarily occurring on day 1, as verse 5 sort of puts it. And that alone is quite a revelation to a lot of people when you realize the Bible doesn't specifically say that God created the earth on day 1 or the universe on day 1. It doesn't specifically say that. Now, as we're looking at it right now, is there room for that? Sure, there might be room for that, but it doesn't specifically say. And that means that it's going to be more flexible than a lot of people are used to dealing with the text. And that's going to be the running theme tonight, is that the Hebrew is a lot more flexible than a lot of English-speaking people believe it is, because they're just used to reading the English translations. So another example of this, of course, is the word yom. The word yom means day, but the word yom is very flexible. Yom can have multiple meanings, including daylight, a 24-hour day, today, or a long time span, like you would use the word in the phrase back in my day, right? You could be referring to the 90s. Obviously, the 90s were 10 years long, so it's not just one day. So the question is when we get to these phrases, these evening and morning phrases, so the evening and the morning were the first day, does it mean one 24-hour day? Or does it mean a long span of time? What does it mean? Now, you may be thinking, well, it says evening and morning. That's one day, isn't it? Well, yeah, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. And I know what you're probably thinking now at this point, if you've listened this long, which is, oh, he's just trying to overcomplicate it. Well, no, I'm not trying to overcomplicate it. Think of yourself right now as trying to read the Hebrew for the first time and understand it from the Hebrew perspective. I guarantee there are things that you're going to miss. For example, the word the in verse 5 from the first day does not exist in Hebrew. I mean, there is a word for the in Hebrew, but that word is not here. It's not there. The word the in English has been put here for clarity. But then the question becomes, does it belong there? Because this word, which is sometimes translated first, which is Ehad, this word changes in its translation depending on whether or not there is an article there. If there is an article, then you use an ordinal number like first. But if there is not an article there, and there is not an article here in verse 5 in the Hebrew, then it should not be an ordinal number, it should be a cardinal number. So in other words, what verse 5 actually says is, so the evening and the morning were one day. Well, that, considering we're talking about creation, that drastically changes the narrative. If it's only one day instead of the first day, then suddenly there is an unspecified amount of time before this one day, potentially, in the beginning. So if there's an unspecified amount of time before this one day, then the Bible does not say how old the earth is. The age of the earth is completely unrelated to the age of humanity. So this is just something to keep in mind. It's this kind of thing that a lot of people take for granted when you're reading the English. Now, some English translations have tried to catch up. They've tried to make these adjustments so that it doesn't sound as specific as our normal translations are used to sounding. But at this point, it's kind of a lost cause because so many people are used to reading it one way and they've memorized it one way. The evening and the morning were the first day. And if you talk to a young earth creationist, let's say a lay person who is a young earth creationist, they're going to flip to verse 5 and they're going to say, the first day, it was the first day. Were there any days before that? No, because it was the first day. But they're overlooking this little detail here, which is that without the Hebrew article, that ordinal number becomes a cardinal number. It's one day. And in the beginning is a block of time. So it doesn't tell us how long the heavens and the earth were there before that one day when God said, let there be light. So right away, I hope you can see that there's a lot more to this than a lot of people realize. And it makes it complicated. It makes it frustrating. Believe me when I say, like, this is frustrating. We all want to know, how did the world begin? And we're so used to turning to the Bible for very, very clear answers. But the truth is that Genesis chapter 1 is very enigmatic. It's an enigma. There's a mystery to it. And we just don't know exactly what it means. So we have to do the best that we can and keep these sorts of details in mind. All right. So with that perspective, there are, of course, still plenty of people who hold to the young earth view. This view is argued for by Ken Ham, Henry Morris, Jonathan Sarfati, and Jason Lyle. These are all very staunch young earth creationists. This view says that God created the entire universe and the earth in 6 consecutive 24-hour days. And they use the genealogies in Genesis chapter 5 to date humanity as being 6,000 years old. And then because they believe that the earth was created 5 days before humans, that means that the earth must be 6,000 years old as well. 6,000 years and 5 days. So this is the young earth view, and nothing that I've said so far would forbid them, like the analysis that we just did on those first 5 verses, none of what I said would forbid them from believing the young earth view. What it would mean is that their support for the young earth view is not as strong as perhaps they would have thought it was, because the text doesn't actually say, it doesn't necessarily say that the earth was created on day 1. So they could still hold to that view, but they can't say that the text definitely means to say that. All right, so obviously one of the strengths of the young earth view is that a very simple, straightforward reading of Genesis chapter 1 as prose historical narrative does result in a young earth view. I mean, if you read it straight through for the first time and you take those days as being 6 consecutive days, you're going to get a young earth view. And of course, the young earth view has been the traditional view for a majority of Jews and Christians throughout history. So that is a strength. That is saying something. And for anyone who might be listening or watching this, and you hold to a young earth view, just know that I am not here tonight to tear down the young earth view. I'm not here to say that the young earth view is hogwash and that you're a completely unreasonable person if you believe it. I'm not saying that. I do think that it is possible for you to read the text and still be a young earth creationist. But I do think what I will say is that I think that young earth creationists need to get better at understanding the different perspectives so that we can all get along better, okay? So that we don't have to fight about this. We shouldn't fight about this. I've already told you that there are 5 things that all of these views hold in common that are all essential to Christianity. So none of these views that we're going to talk about tonight are in contradiction to essential doctrines of Christianity. It's just about the specifics. So just keep that in mind. And I would encourage you, if you're a young earth creationist listening to this or watching this, that you would just be willing to open your mind up a little bit, open up your heart, as it were, to some different perspectives and try to soak this in. I think you'll be rather surprised at how much there is to examine here in chapter 1 of Genesis. I do think there are some weaknesses to the young earth view, though. One is that the origins of Genesis itself are mysterious, which means that we can't be certain of its intended genre. A lot of young earth creationists just sort of presume that the author of Genesis chapter 1 intends for it to be read as history. But the trouble is we don't know exactly who wrote it, and we can't be entirely certain that they intended for it to be understood as pure history. Maybe they just meant it to be understood as sort of a cool myth. Now, even if that was true of the original narrative, it doesn't seem like Moses would have wanted it that way. Moses seems to have included it in his history book, which means there's got to be some degree of history in it somehow. So that's granted. But still, we can't just presume that everything is meant to be understood as literally as possible from our point of view, because literal to the Hebrews may not have meant the same thing that it means to us. Which brings up our second weakness here of the young earth view, which is that the Hebrew language is very flexible. And so it's not as clear as a lot of English translations make Genesis sound. And we're going to see some of those reasons tonight. I mean, we've already looked at a couple of them, which goes to show that it doesn't preclude the young earth view, but it does mean that there are other possibilities. Another thing to keep in mind, too, is that there are probably gaps in those genealogies, and we're not really going to talk about that tonight. I'm sorry that we don't have time to do that, but I mean, it's the truth, and more young earth creationists are coming to see that, which is why they're willing to expand the age of the earth back a little bit. Some of them are going back to 10,000 years. Some of them are going back 50,000 years. So they're starting to stretch it a little bit because they're realizing that those genealogies are not exactly watertight. And again, unfortunately, I just don't have time to go over that tonight. And another weakness of the young earth view is that some of God's proclamations on these 6 creation days simply could not be fulfilled in one day. And I'm sure that for a lot of you, this is probably the first time you've even heard this idea. It's like, what do you mean they couldn't be fulfilled in one day? Well, let me show you. Here's a selection of verses from chapter 1. Verses 11 and 12 say, "Then God said, let the earth bring forth grass, etc. And the earth brought forth grass." And then verse 22 says, "And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. Then God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind. And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind. Then God blessed them, mankind, and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, Fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over it. Every living thing that moves. Over every living thing that moves. All right, so what am I getting at here? The point is that if you claim to read the Bible literally, and I mean this, if you're one of those people who says, I just believe what the Bible says, then you need to take account of what I'm about to tell you. Because what this says, verse 11, God said, let the earth bring forth grass. In other words, let the earth do it. It does not say that God snapped his fingers and suddenly a bunch of trees sprouted out of the ground and there were forests. God said, let the earth do it. And verse 12 even reaffirms this. And the earth brought forth grass and the trees, etc. The earth did it. The earth did it itself. God started a natural process and the earth did it. Now, can that happen in a day? No, it can't. If the earth is going to bring forth grass, grass doesn't grow in a day. Or trees, much less trees that sprout fruit. So that's not going to happen in a day. So if you claim to read the text literally, that's what you need to take into account, because that's what it says. It says the earth did it. And if you think to yourself, well, God could have created full-grown trees, and then they just sort of, they have started the photosynthesis, ecological process, so it has started. So it started in one day. I would say, okay, fair enough. Maybe you could do that. I'm not sure if I buy that, because God said, let the earth do it. But consider what he said to the animals. God blessed the sea creatures by saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters of the seas. And he says the same thing about the birds. Let the birds multiply on the earth. So the sea creatures and the birds have to do it themselves. So if you're going to use the same kind of logic that it's like, well, maybe God started the process, well, then it kind of sounds like you're saying that all the sea creatures and all the birds just started procreating on the first day that they existed. And I guess that's possible, but it just seems like you're trying to force the text to say something different. It seems like you're trying to force all of this to happen in one day when the most obvious reading of it seems to imply that it started to happen over a long period of time. They start multiplying. It's not like birds procreate and then just immediately start laying eggs. They got to incubate a little. They got to be pregnant for a while. So, it says let the animals do it. And then what's interesting is in verse 24, God says, let the earth bring forth the living creature according to its kind. So let the earth do it. And then, of course, it does say that God made the beast of the earth. So God does have to make them first. And this brings up a question of what does the text mean by saying, let the earth do it? And we're going to bring that back up in a while later tonight. But suffice to say that, the animals are taking care of themselves at this point. And then in verse 28, God says the same thing to mankind. He says to mankind, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over everything. And mankind has to do it themselves. They don't automatically have dominion. They haven't automatically subdued the earth. They have to go do it themselves. And of course, they're not going to fill the earth in one day. They have to do that themselves. So these proclamations, at least 3 of God's proclamations on days 3, 5, and 6, could not be fulfilled in one day, if you're reading the text as literally as it's written. And I emphasize that because so many young earth creationists absolutely insist that they read the text incredibly literally. And what I'm saying is that if you're honestly doing it that way, then it seems like you're missing something, because on at least 3 occasions, God says, let the earth do it, let the animals do it, let the humans do it. So that is the literal reading. Can that happen in a day? No, it can't. Now, I know that you're probably thinking now, but the days are there, right? What do you do with the days? Okay, that's good. Well, this is how we get different views. So now you can see, this is how you start sort of trying to move the boundaries of our definition of what's happening in Genesis chapter 1. We have to try a different shape, see if it fits through the hole the right way, right? So now we come to the old earth views. Because obviously, if these proclamations can't be fulfilled in one day, then you need more time. So how do you deal with the days that are mentioned there in Genesis chapter 1? Hence the topic of tonight's presentation, the days of Genesis. The day-age view is advocated by Hugh Ross, and Hugh Ross has popularized this view very well. His ministry, Reasons to Believe, is an incredible ministry, and I would highly recommend that you look into everything they do. Hugh Ross is a scientist. He has a team of scientists who help him minister from a scientific perspective. And they put out a lot of really great material, and they're friends. So I highly recommend everything that they put out. But they are not above their views being examined, which is what we're doing tonight. So what the day-age view says is that the 6 creation days are actually 6 long ages of unspecified length, and that we are currently in the 7th day, which is kind of an interesting thought, that we're currently in the 7th day when God has rested from creation. And of course, one of the benefits of this view is that Genesis becomes compatible with present scientific majority opinions that the universe and the earth are actually billions of years old. So if you have long ages, then it's a lot easier to just say, well, the science says it's the universe is 13 billion years old, so we can just go with that. And of course, a strength of the day-age view is it does make use of the word yom in a way that I think is appropriate for the word yom, that it could refer to a long span of time, so that the processes that God creates in Genesis 1 couldn't be accomplished in one day, therefore the days must represent long periods of time. So this is a benefit of the day-age view, and most old earth creationists today are probably day-age view old earth creationists, simply because Hugh Ross has made this view so popular. And that's fine. I think, it's a very, like, as I've said, just like with the young earth view, I think it's a very adequate view. I think it probably solves more problems than it creates. But none of the views tonight are devoid of at least some problems. So one of the weaknesses, of course, of the day-age view is that evening and morning phrase, which does seem to indicate that those days are consecutive 24-hour days. Otherwise, what does that phrase mean? Otherwise. Now, I'm not saying that Hugh Ross doesn't have an answer to this, because he's written dozens of books, and I would definitely encourage you to read them. But this is still sort of a loose thread in the day-age view. And another one is that, scientifically speaking, there are problems with the scientific order. So, for example, according to the day-age view, the birds would have existed before the land animals, but this contradicts the fossil record. Because according to modern evolutionary theory, birds evolved from land creatures that came from the ocean. So you have to have ocean creatures evolving into land creatures that then evolve into birds. But in the day-age view, where the chronology is the same with each of the days, you still have birds before animals. Now, there is one interesting way to deal with that, which is that the Hebrew word for birds in Genesis chapter 1 is actually more broad than just meaning birds. It means all flying things, which would include insects. So potentially, one of the ways you could reconcile this is to say that there were flying creatures before the land animals, but they were insects. They weren't necessarily birds. And then the birds came later. So the birds were the word, the Hebrew word. So that's one way you could deal with that. So that's the day-age view. So let's look at these consecutive days. Do they need to be consecutive? Obviously, you have one day, and then second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. But of course, there is no evening and morning phrase for day 7, which is why the day-age view says that we are still in day 7, because according to Genesis, it hasn't ended yet. Which is, again, very interesting thought. And Hugh Ross has an interesting biblical defense for that using the book of Hebrews. I'm not quite sure that I agree with the way that he interprets some of those verses, but I mean, I think it's probably a valid way to look at the text. But I still think that this consecutive days problem is still a problem for the day-age view, because, I mean, verse 5 does seem to indicate that Yom is a 24-hour day. The reason is because God calls the light day, and the darkness he calls night. So it's clearly beginning a day-night process here, where the light is the daytime, and that is day, that is Yom, and you put the day and the night together, the evening and the morning, and you have one Yom. So consecutive 24-hour days, it seems like the most comfortable way to read the text. But again, as we've already said, it sounds like a lot of these proclamations can't be fulfilled in one day. So if you have proclamations that can't be fulfilled in one day, but you still have literal 24-hour days happening consecutively, then what do you do? Well, enter the gap view. The gap view is advocated by Arthur C. Custance, and he argued that there is a long gap of time, actually, between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. What he says is that the conditions of the earth in Genesis 1:2 are due to God's judgment on a previous civilization, whether possibly humans or possibly angelic, which wiped them out with a flood, and then God reconstructed the earth as a perfect, sinless place without death to start over with Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve were created 6,000 years ago, but the earth itself and the universe are billions of years old because there have been previous civilizations living on the earth. I bet a lot of you listening probably did not know that this view was even a thing until just now. But the truth is that this view used to be very popular. And the reason is because a lot of people who used to read the King James Version predominantly ended up believing this view for a couple of reasons. But let me just say, one of the strengths of this view is that it recognizes that Genesis 1:1 does represent a period of time preceding the creation days, preceding the 6 days, since the creation of the earth is not necessarily included in day 1. So it has that going for it, as we've already said tonight. But one of the weaknesses of the view, obviously, is that there does seem to be a lack of scientific evidence for this. People who believe in the gap view, they kind of use the scientific evidence that young earth creationists use to argue for the flood. They use that to argue for God wiping out a previous civilization and then creating Adam and Eve. So there's a bit of equivocation there with the scientific evidence. It doesn't render the view very strong. But the biggest weakness is that the Old Testament support for the idea of a previous judgment is extremely weak. Improved translations have rendered the gap view nearly indefensible. So let me show you what I mean by that. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 28 from the King James Version. Look at what it says here. It's really interesting. And God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Replenish the earth? How do you replenish the earth unless it had been replenished already? So in King James, if you're reading this, you're thinking, well, if you have to replenish the earth, then there must have been something there before, right? Well, fortunately, we don't have to think about this for very long, because this word milu in the Hebrew that was translated replenish in the King James Version is just a bad translation. It can't mean that. Milu means to fill, fulfill, or carry out. So that's why most modern translations have fixed this to say, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And that makes a lot more sense. It doesn't give the impression that there was something there before and now you need to fix it. It's that this is brand new and now you need to fill up the earth with people. Okay? So better, newer translations have corrected this mistake. And there are other mistakes like that in the King James Version. In fact, I read the New King James Version for my daily devotionals. And even there, I have to be careful because even the New King James Version still has some translation problems that I've just learned to pay attention to over the years as I've studied. But this is something we should all keep in mind, is that our English translations are susceptible to these sorts of mistakes because we're not reading the original language. So you have to understand that if you're trying to do a detailed exegesis of the text, which is what we are doing with Genesis chapter 1 tonight, you have to look at the Hebrew. You have to. You cannot do an analysis of Genesis chapter 1 in English. If you're only trying to do it in English, you're not going to succeed. You're trying to drive a car with your hands tied together and your feet tied together and you're blindfolded. It doesn't work. You can't do it. You have to use the Hebrew. And the gap view is exhibit A for why you need the Hebrew. All right, so then we come to the framework view, which was advocated by Meredith Kline. Kline argued that the 7 days don't represent actual periods of time, but they're only a figurative literary framework, a narrative illustration of God's creative process. So the creation events in Genesis chapter 1 are literally true. Everything that Genesis 1 says is literally true, but the days that are mentioned are just kind of a literary invention for the sake of memorizing the story or whatever. And if you've ever heard that you can memorize the days of creation using sort of a three-step mnemonic, that comes from this framework view. So for example, day 1, God says, let there be light, and there's light. And then day 4, which would be parallel to it, is when God creates the sun, moon, and the stars. It's like, so he creates a space, and then he fills that space with something that's related to it. So day 2 is the separation of the firmament, of the firmaments, the firmament below and above. And then day 5 is the sea creatures and the birds that fill the firmament below and the firmament above. See how that works? Then day 3 is the dry land and the plants. And then day 6 is the animals and humans. So that sort of way of looking at it, it does help you memorize it. And it's possible that the Hebrews looked at it that way. So, that sort of thing lends support to the framework view, which has been a very popular view in times past. And I think there are probably still a lot of old Earth creationists who probably hold to this. And the framework view does tend to be accompanied by old Earth science. So one of the strengths, of course, is that the days are arranged topically, not chronologically. So this helps us make sense of things like light being created before the sources of light, which, is a pretty glaring problem, even if you're reading the text as literally as possible. It's like, well, where is light coming from before the sun, moon, and the stars are around? That is a strength of the framework view, that you when you turn the days into being arranged topically instead of chronologically, it does seem to help make sense of the events that are happening there. However, one of the weaknesses, of course, is that if those days are truly metaphorical, then that means the rest of the story could be metaphorical too. So there's no way to differentiate between what is metaphor or what's history. And I mean, if you think about this long, and I don't think you have to think about this very long for it to make sense. If you're saying that one piece of the story is metaphorical, then what prevents you from saying that every other part of the story is not? You could very easily slip into saying that it's all metaphorical and that all of this is for naught. It's just a made-up story. So that's a danger of this kind of view. And then there's the problem that the chronology of the days does seem to demand some kind of chronology for the events on those days, such as God's proclamation. So even if the proclamations couldn't have been fulfilled in one day, it still seems like something needs to happen in the order that the Bible says it did, like God's proclamations. So it seems like God's proclamations still have to happen in the order of the days as they're presented. And if that's the case, then the framework view is not technically true because it's no longer topical. It is still historically chronological in some sense. So that's why the framework view, that's the Achilles heel of the framework view, basically, which is those ordinal numbers. Even though day 1 is just one day, I mean, days 2 through 6 are still 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th. So there seems to be something to that. So let's talk about those celestial bodies. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but this is day 1 and day 4. So on day 1, God creates light and the division between day and night. That's really interesting. And then on day 4, God creates the sun, moon, and the stars, and he says, let them be used for signs in the heavens. Well, one of the things that I think is really important when we look at this, and this is going to seem really nitpicky, is that in verse 16, English translations say, then God made 2 great lights, which makes it sound like God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens, and then he made the great lights. But in Hebrew, that word then is not there. It is not there. It goes straight from, let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give lights on the earth, and it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. There is no chronological connection between these 2 phrases in these verses. The word then is not there. In fact, in Hebrew, and I can't remember the word that is used for this, but the Hebrew word that would be used for then can also mean and. But it's not there at all in this case. So it's not like you get to choose which one you want based on context. It's just not there. The first word in verse 16 is God. That's what I'm saying. So what this means is that there's no requirement from the text that any of the proclamations be fulfilled on the day that God proclaimed them. The fulfillment phrases are functionally parenthetical. In other words, what I just said, the fulfillment phrases are functionally parenthetical. It means that verse 16 on day 4 is a parenthetical statement to the proclamations. The proclamation is, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens. But in parentheses, you can interpret this as having happened in parentheses, that God is the one who made those 2 great lights that are up in the heavens, so that it doesn't necessarily have to happen on that day. Am I saying that this is the definitive way to read this text? No, I'm saying this is a serious possibility that a lot of people are overlooking. And because Hebrew was a very simple language with not a lot of words and not a lot of, well, not really any punctuation, it's very difficult to make out exactly what they meant when they wrote stuff like this. So, did you have a question? I saw you raise your hand.
Kind of answered. I was like, how can God make the light and then make the light again?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what's kind of interesting about this, right? I mean, look at the similarity between verse 4. God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Look how similar that is to verse 18, or 17 and 18. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. It says the same thing.
It's like he made the concept of light and darkness, like there's air and water, and then created the form of the moon and the sun as a separate conduit for the light and the darkness.
Yeah, I mean, you could read it that way. It's like, well, there's light sitting over here, and now there's darkness over here, and now I'm going to put a sun between them. That is a God question, yeah. There may be more to this, though, and we will come to that in just a little bit.
There's always more to this.
I know there is always more to this. I told you. This is an infinite wormhole. All right, so we come to the analogical days view. This originates from C. John Collins. In this view, the 7 days are analogous to a human work week, but they are God's work days, which means that they don't necessarily have any sequence or specified length. So this is very similar to the day-age view. It's also very similar to the framework view, because with the day-age view, the days represent actual long periods of time. So that's what the analogical days view say. Except that in the analogical days view, the days are presented analogically as earth days. So in other words, we're not meant to understand that these are earth days, but they're God's days, whatever that looks like. They're God's work days. Now, how is that different from the framework view, where the days are just basically metaphorical? The difference is that with the framework view, the days are not literal periods of time. They're a literary invention. The days didn't have to happen in separate periods of time. But with the analogical days view, they are literal periods of time. They're not human days, they're God's days. So they could be any length. So one of the strengths of the analogical days view is that the days represent actual periods of time, as we've said, and they're not simply figurative as in the framework view. So this lends credence to the historicity of the story, even though the days are expressed analogically. But a weakness of the analogical days view, of course, is that the chronology of the days still seems to demand some kind of chronology for the events on those days, such as God's proclamations. So we haven't addressed this chronology problem. And it is still difficult to differentiate between the literal and the non-literal portions of the story. So this same objection applies to the framework view and the analogical days view, which is that if you're saying that one part of this is not literal, then what prevents you from saying that the rest of it is not literal? There's nothing there. So what do we do? What do we do with the literal versus non-literal problem? So let's use this as an example. This is day 1. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, so the evening and the morning were the first day. Well, if the evening and the morning phrases and the ordinal days are only analogies, then why isn't the rest of the narrative an analogy? How could we insist that the ordinal days are analogies, but the day and the night that God created are not? I mean, it's literally there in the same verse. Not that the verse numbers are original. By the way, I should probably say that because a lot of people probably don't know that. The chapter numbers and the verse numbers are not in the Hebrew. Those are much, much, much later additions. We're talking like just a few hundred years ago. Those were not around, not even in Jesus' time. They didn't have those reference numbers for the Old Testament. So those numbers are not there. They mean nothing to the original Hebrew. They're just there for our reference sake. So in Genesis chapter 1, there seems to be no discernible interpretive principle to differentiate between symbolic and literal language. It all seems to be literal. And this means that I think that everybody should take this seriously, which is that this means that either the entire narrative is symbolic or the entire narrative is literal, but it can't be a mixture of both. I don't know how you could make it a mixture of both. And I would apply this to, for example, William Lane Craig's view of Genesis being mytho-history. Now, I love Dr. Craig dearly, of course, but I just don't see how you can differentiate between some parts being myth and some parts being literal or historical, because we have no defining principle, no interpretive principle to help us tell which is which. So you could just declare the entire thing symbolic and nobody could stop you. I mean, you could insist that parts of it must be historic in some way, but I haven't seen any method explained for how we would make that distinction, which is very concerning to me personally. I just don't know what to do with it without some kind of principle to determine that. All right, so the next view is the intermittent days view, which is advocated by Robert Newman and, surprisingly, John Lennox, who's a very popular Christian apologist. This view says that the 7 days are literal 24-hour days, but they're separated by long periods for God's proclamations to be fulfilled. So in other words, they are the days are literal 24-hour days, and they are in the same, well, no, they're not necessarily in the same chronological order, but they're real days, but they're just divided by long periods of time. So the intermittent periods could be short ages or they could be long ages, which means this could be a young Earth view, it could be an old Earth view. But the length of the periods and the chronology of the events is completely irrelevant, so you don't even have to worry about that. And of course, I mean, a strength of this view is that it does interpret those days literally as 24-hour days, which is good. But a weakness, of course, is that I think contrary to what the intermittent days view says, the days do sound consecutive in the text. And the reason is because if the time periods between the days have no specific length, and if the chronology doesn't matter at all, and if the proclamations were not necessarily fulfilled during those intermittent time periods, then the days are just historically and literarily meaningless. It's like, why are they even there? It seems like you've just sort of thrown them out there as being real days just so you can say that they're there. But textually and historically, they have no meaning. They're just there. And that just doesn't seem to help us make any sense whatsoever of the text. So I don't see how there's any benefit to the intermittent days view, besides interpreting the days literally as 24-hour days. There's also the limited creation view, which is advocated by John Sailhamer. This is another kind of a strange view a lot of people aren't aware of, which is that these days are only about the creation of the promised land, not the entire universe or the earth, but just the promised land. Because, after all, the Pentateuch is about the Hebrews inheriting the promised land. That's what it's about. And Genesis is the beginning of the Pentateuch. So if you look at the Pentateuch as one literary work, then you could see that, well, maybe Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is really about the creation of the land promised to the Jews and not necessarily about everything else. So only Genesis 1:1 would be about the creation of the entire universe and the earth, but verse 1:2 only concerns a limited portion of the earth, not the entire earth. So it is similar to the gap view because Adam and Eve could have lived 6,000 years ago, but the rest of creation would have occurred long before that. So again, it's another one of those views where, it could be young earth, it could be old earth, it doesn't really matter. So one of the strengths of this view is that, of course, it does say that the beginning occurs before the 6 days, and it's undetermined amount of time. But the biggest strength of this view is it makes use of this other principle that I'm about to explain to you, which is that the word Eres in Hebrew, which is translated as earth, is better understood to mean land, which provides a lot of clarity to the rest of the narrative when you take that into account. Now, I'll explain that to you in just a moment. So that is a strength going for the limited creation view. But the weakness of this view is that the idea that Genesis only applies to the promised land causes a lot of bizarre interpretive problems. So, for example, even Sailhamer says that when God says, "Let there be light," he's merely just describing the sunrise on the first day of the week that was already there. It was already going to happen. But why would God command something to happen that was already going to happen anyway? It's kind of like when you go through the automatic sliding doors at the grocery store and you wave your hand like you're a Jedi. The doors were going to open whether you did that with your hand or not. I mean, that would be literally what Sailhamer is saying God is doing on day one of creation. He says, "Let there be light," but he just times it just right on day one so that the sun comes up as he says, "Let there be light." So there just doesn't seem to be any significant meaning behind this, as interesting of an idea as it is. So let's talk about this word Eres, the earthly perspective of the narrative. When we look at this word Eres, that's usually translated earth in Genesis chapter 1, it means literally the land, the ground, the soil, or it could mean the country, which is where that limited creation view is coming from, the country of the promised land, or it could just mean the world. But one thing that it doesn't mean is the planet, which is kind of funny because that's how most English readers are going to read it. Because in the day and age that we've grown up in, we're used to seeing pictures of planet Earth from space. We've seen pictures taken by satellites and space shuttles and moonlanders. We know that the Earth is a sphere, that it's a circle, that it's not flat. Or do we? When we hear the word Earth, we think of the planet Earth. But for these ancient Hebrews, they didn't have satellite pictures to look at. When they used the word Eres, they were talking about the land. They're talking about the ground. So we can't read the text as meaning the planet, because that wasn't the understanding of the ancient Hebrews. And what this also means is that the phrase, the heavens and the earth, does not mean, as we might think in English, it doesn't mean the universe and the planet Earth. It's a Hebrew idiom. It's a turn of phrase that the Hebrews use. It just means everything above and below. So if you're looking at the horizon, everything above is in the sky and everything below is on the ground. So when the Hebrews say in the Old Testament, whenever it says the heavens and the earth, what it means is just everything. It's like us saying the whole shebang, or the whole 9 yards, or the whole enchilada, which are much less majestic ways of putting it. But the Hebrews said the heavens and the earth. You know, it's like, oh, you're going to charge me $20 for a taco? Why don't you just charge me for the heavens and the earth too? You know, just toss in everything, right? So that's what that phrase means, which means that it is not necessarily talking about it's not necessarily talking about space and the planet Earth. It's just saying everything above and below. It doesn't necessarily in Hebrew connotate a vision of outer space or the solar system or the universe or galaxies or anything like that. It just means everything above and everything below, which also means that it does not account for the creation of the earth on day one. So this is further support for that idea, because it isn't saying that God created the planet Earth. It just means he created everything above and everything below, which includes everything that we already see. But obviously it doesn't include everything we already see, because the rest of the narrative explains where a lot of that stuff came from. So it just doesn't mean that. Furthermore, when you understand now that the word Eres means land or ground, verse 2 ends up indicating that the narrative perspective of Genesis chapter 1 is from the surface of the earth. And a lot of people miss this. The narrative perspective is not from space looking down on the entire planet, as if God is sort of floating over the entire planet. No, it's from the earthly perspective, from the face of the deep, the face of the waters, the surface of the ocean. If you were imagining what the Hebrew author is imagining, you're imagining yourself hovering over the surface of the ocean. That's where you are. That is the perspective of the narrative, which means that there in verse 2, the earth is already there and it's completely covered in water. And this is going to give us a clue as to how there could be light before there could be planets. Because suddenly, you don't have to imagine the earth being covered in light on one half and covered in shadow on the other without a sun. Now you're on the surface of the earth. And when God says, let there be light, the clouds lift. And suddenly light starts to penetrate the atmosphere. And then later when God says, let the heavens be filled with the sun, moon, and the stars, what it means is the clouds dissipate. And suddenly you can see the sun, moon, and the stars. And now you can use them for signs and seasons. So, if you look at it that way, it actually aligns quite perfectly with what we know scientifically about the original stages of planet Earth, because we do know that Earth was originally covered not only in water, but in a thick atmospheric cloud that no light could penetrate. And then eventually, as those clouds started to lighten up, literally, suddenly light could come through to the surface of the water and pierce more of the water. And then eventually, those clouds lifted and there became a firmament between the clouds and the water. And that's how our atmosphere formed. And then eventually, those clouds started to dissipate so that there was clear space among the clouds so that you can finally see the stars and the sun and the moon. So, if you understand the days as occurring that way, you're not restricted to think that the sun and the moon and the stars didn't exist until day 4 of creation. It's like, no, they were there, they just weren't visible. Because this is from the perspective of the surface of the earth. So, very interesting. It's really a game changer. Go back and read the text, and I think you'll see it very easily. All right, let's talk about the revelatory days view. This was advocated by a father-son team named P.J. Wiseman and Donald Wiseman. What it says is that the 7 days are not the time span of creation, but rather 7 days in which the story was gradually revealed by God to the human author of Genesis chapter 1. So in other words, God is gradually revealing the story over the course of 7 days to whoever he's revealing it to, which is, that's an interesting idea. What this does mean is that the age of the earth is not directly relevant to the story at all, not really. I mean, one of the strengths of this is that the days are still literal 24-hour days, so, we have that going for us. But unfortunately, there is just no contextual evidence that God is gradually revealing this account to a human author. I mean, you might think in comparison to, say, the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is standing on the shore of the Jordan River and he has this vision and he describes that's where he is and where it happened. And he even says that there were people around him. And of course, the Apostle John had his vision for the book of Revelation while he was on the island of Patmos. But Genesis doesn't say anything like that. It doesn't give us any of that context. It doesn't say that Moses went and stood at the edge of, the Red Sea and God suddenly gave him a vision of day one of creation on Monday, and then the next day on Tuesday, he gave him the vision of the firmament. It doesn't say that. So it's just not there. Rather, the text does seem to indicate that the days were literal moments in time prior to the writing of the story when God was interacting with an incomplete creation. Now let's talk very briefly about the cosmic temple view, and I say very briefly because the cosmic temple view is pretty complicated. But this is John Walton's view, and I'm willing to bet that at least some people listening to this or watching this have probably read a John Walton book. He's the one who writes those really nice-looking books called The Lost World series, which is The Lost World of Genesis, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, The Lost World of the Flood. They look really sleek and stylish. He has a very simple manner of writing that's very easy to understand, so a lot of people latch onto it really quick. And he is a scholar. He's a very nice guy, a very smart guy. But what he says is that Genesis chapter 1 does not actually present the material creation of the world, but only the functional creation of the world. So he argues that ancient cosmologies, meaning the ancient creation stories of, the ancient Near Eastern people, he argues that they didn't have a concept of material creation of the world. They believed that the material was just sort of always there. So there was only a functional creation at some point where everything started functioning, everything started moving, everything started working. Well, the example that John Walton gives for this is a college. Think about what it takes to create a college. Have you created a college when you build all the buildings and you fill it with tables and chairs and computers? Is it then a college? Or is it a college when the professors start teaching and giving out grades? You see? So there's a material creation, but there's also a functional creation. Now, that's a very clever way of looking at this. It is. And I'm not going to argue with John Walton that perhaps ancient people did have that understanding. I mean, I could, but I won't tonight. But I mean, that is how he's approaching Genesis chapter 1. He's going to say that God materially created the world in an unknown way and at an unknown time, but then that God inaugurated the function of creation over a literal 6-day week in which he sort of blesses his cosmic temple. So he calls it the cosmic temple view. Now, obviously, this is going to be really strange to a lot of people, but also ironically, a lot of people have been really enjoying his books because he has a very convincing way of writing. So, I mean, one of the strengths of John Walton's view is that he does give very fair consideration to the potential textual interests of ancient audiences. So he does broaden his scope to the entire ancient Near East, which that's relevant. That's a noble task. And of course, the creation week doesn't necessarily coincide with the material creation of the universe and the earth, which really frees us up. It gives us a lot of flexibility, way more elbow room than we asked for in terms of how to interpret the text. That these don't even represent the material creation of the days. it's more topical than anything. It's just God inaugurating the light as day and night, even though it was already there, and then inaugurating the sun, moon, and stars 3 days later, even though they were already there, because it's not about the order of material creation, it's just about him inaugurating it. And it doesn't really matter what the order is. But I do think that one of the weaknesses of this view is that the text does seem to explicitly describe a material creation of plants, animals, and humans, at the very least. Plants, animals, and humans. There doesn't seem to be any plants before God creates the dry land, or the firmament, or light. How could there be plants without light? It doesn't seem to be there. Also, the text does say that God made the animals. And then in chapter 2, it says God made the animals from the dirt, from the dust. And then it says God made the humans from the dust. Well, even if you postulate that the dust was already there, you're still saying that there weren't any humans until God formed them from the dust. That's still a material creation. Maybe not material explicitly in the sense of the material that they're made of, but at least a formal cause of these people, that there was no form of a human until God made them. So in that sense, I think that there's certainly an implication of material creation in Genesis chapter 1. And another weakness of Walton's view is that he wants to follow this intuition that material creation occurred separate from the days of proclamation, which is why he places the material creation prior to the inaugural week. But look at what he's doing here. He's saying something very similar to what we've already been saying, which is that the proclamations can't be fulfilled in one day, right? So what does he do? He puts the fulfillment before the days and says the material creation already happened, and then the day is just sort of an inauguration. But I don't know. To me, the proclamations seem to not allow for that kind of separation between material creation and functional creation. To me, it sounds like it's both. And Dr. Craig, I think, had some really good things to say about Walton's view in his book. And my dad addresses John Walton's view in his book as well, in Genesis, Science, and the Beginning. So there are some fair criticisms of Walton's view. But what if, I'm just throwing this out there, because now we've arrived at my view of Genesis. If the proclamations can't be fulfilled in one day, what if we move the creation from before the day, like John Walton has it, and put it after the day? What happens? What you get is the prophetic days view, which was originally called the Days of Divine Fiat view, which is how Alan Hayward defended it in the 20th century. But my dad revived this view by calling it the prophetic days view. And so the way that this works is that the 7 days of Genesis are literal, consecutive, 24-hour days in which God prophesied or proclaimed what he was going to create and fulfill over a later amount of time. So the 7 days occurred after an unspecified period of time in the beginning, during which the universe and the earth were created. But then the proclamations were fulfilled after the 7 days in which they were proclaimed. So the 7 days are sandwiched in between two unknown periods of time, but they're consecutive days. They're all together. And what's really interesting about this, and very handy, I think, is that it is open to young earth views and old earth views. It's open to young earth science and old earth science because it doesn't determine the age of the earth. So in the prophetic days view, the age of the earth is not told to us. The Bible does not tell us the age of the earth at all. Doesn't even come close. The amount of time it took is not told to us at all. So I do believe there are some good strengths to this view. In the beginning, in Genesis chapter 1, it's a period of time prior to the 7-day creation week, which is what we've already talked about. The days are literal, consecutive 24-hour days, which has been a consistent recurring problem in a lot of the views that we've seen already. And then, of course, the unique detail of the prophetic days view is that God's proclamations are not fulfilled on the literal day that he proclaimed them, but later over an unspecified length of time. Now, that is sort of like the intermittent days view. If you remember, the intermittent days view says that the day was a literal day, but then it took a long amount of time for the proclamation on that day to be fulfilled. The trouble with the intermittent days view is that it didn't take the chronology seriously. It said that the chronology didn't matter and the amount of time didn't really matter. But what the prophetic days view says is the chronology is still there. You preserve the chronology, one day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, seventh day. It's right there, and they're consecutive, so there's not long periods between them. But it's just God proclaiming over 6 days what he's going to fulfill over an unspecified amount of time. I think over the time that science tells us. 13 billion years for the universe, and then, 4 billion years for the earth. But if we were to ask if there are any weaknesses with the prophetic days view, we would say that, well, God does seem to declare his creation as good on each of those days. So on each day, God says, or there is a phrase along the lines of, God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the whatever day. And another weakness would potentially be that if these proclamations were declared for 1 week prior to most of creation, then most of the proclamations don't make sense because there's no context for them. So in other words, in this view, God is proclaiming onto an empty earth, let there be animals to eat the plants, except that it's still day 2 and there's no dry land. So it just seems strange. It strikes people as strange to imagine that happening, that God takes 6 days to declare what he's going to do over a long period of time, and then there's no context, especially if the angels are the ones listening to him. If he says to the angels, hey, imagine there's going to be some dry land there, and then there's going to be some plants, and then there's going to be a porcupine who's going to really enjoy those berries. And the angels are like, I don't see anything but water. And God says, I know, but just wait. Fast forward 4 billion years, and you have porcupines. And the angels were like, all right, you got us. Yeah. So yes, there is a way you can look at this where it looks kind of silly. But looking silly is not really a logical objection. God can do what he wants. The question is not why would God do it this way? The question is, what did God do according to the text? I mean, God could have created us 5 seconds ago with all of our life memories already intact. He could have created us already sitting in this room. And we wouldn't know. But why would he do that? Well, we can't say. He's God. Why would God take billions of years to create the universe? I don't know. Why would he take 6 days to create the entire universe? I don't know. Why didn't he just do it in 1 day? Why 6 days? So that question is just not a valid objection. So if I could take time to answer these objections here. So why does God seem to declare his creation good on the day? Well, I think that this is overlooking the fact that the proclamations can't be fulfilled in 1 day. So for example, let the earth bring forth, or let the animals or the humans be fruitful and multiply. Those things can't be fulfilled in 1 day, so God is not going to be able to see that they're good until they have occurred. And what that means is that all you really have to do, if you understand the if you understand the fulfillment phrases as parenthetical to the days, as parenthetical fulfillment phrases, all you have to do is just include, and God saw that it was good, as part of the parenthetical phrase. So you're already there. You just kind of have to take that next step. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think "and it was good" could also be the state of creation at that point? Like, kind of as a preface to what happens with Adam and Eve in the fall? Like, and it was good, and then whenever the fall happened, it's like, well, that was unfortunate. It's like the first.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, and even in that case, it doesn't necessarily matter when God sees that it's good. It could be at any point.
Yeah.
But yeah, because that brings up the question, who is it good for?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, God doesn't need anything, so why would it be good for him?
Yeah.
It would only be good for him in that it would make him happy. But he's creating the earth for humans, so it's good for them. So yeah, it's a very, I think that's a very good way to look at it. It's good for humans, and it was good. Everything was good for humans until they sinned. All right, now for weakness number 2. So if the proclamations were declared for 1 week prior to most of creation, then the proclamations don't really make sense because there's no context for them. All right, well, you could use this objection that there's no context for these prophecies. You could use this objection for any of God's prophecies in the whole Bible. Like, for example, when God says that the virgin will give birth in Isaiah, well, it's not as if he ever declared that the virgin would be born. I mean, does he have to be that specific? I mean, is that part of his God superpowers? He has to be super specific, or else like his God powers are going to betray him like a sarcastic genie or something. Like, no, you can't wish for more wishes. It's like, well, you didn't say the virgin would be born, so the virgin can't give birth to the Savior. It's like no, I don't think God has to be that specific. I think he can do what he wants, and he says what he wants when he wants to say it, and he says as much as he wants when he wants to say it. So I don't think that this is a valid objection in that sense. Or you could also apply this in Genesis chapter 1 itself, for example, to the creation of light. Well, I mean, if we're going to get really picky, God never declares for space to exist. He never declares for time to exist. He just declares that there will be things in space and things in time. But he never actually created space and time, according to Genesis chapter 1. So if you're going to be that picky and that literal about it, then I think you're really doing yourself more of a disservice than anything. So the effect and the timing of God's creation does not seem to depend on the specificity of God's words, nor the understanding of his audience, such as the angels. It doesn't matter what the angels understood him to mean. He was still going to do it the way that he wanted to do it. God can speak things into existence in any context at all, and in any way he wants. Again, he could have done it in 6 days. He could have done it in 1,000,000 years. Why did he proclaim it over 6 days and fulfill it over millions of years? I don't know. He could have declared it all in 5 seconds and fulfilled it in a week, but he didn't. At least that's not what we've been told. So we have to go by what we've been told and the best way to interpret the text. So, all things considered that we've talked about tonight, the prophetic days view ends up looking like this. There is a moment of time prior to the 6 days of creation. And this moment, this period, not really a moment, but this period of time is the beginning. Now, there was a first moment of time. Scientifically, we might call that the Big Bang. But it doesn't matter if the Big Bang was there or not, because there was just an unspecified period of time that was just the beginning of the universe and the earth. They were there already. And then come the 7 days of proclamation. And God proclaims what he's going to create. And then in a third unspecified amount of time, God fulfills those proclamations until he creates Adam and Eve. Now, here I've put old earth ages, but the truth is that you could fill this in with young earth ages as well. You could say that the beginning as a block of time was, let's say, 1 day prior to day 1, or you could say that it was the first hour of day 1, of the first day. Doesn't matter, the text doesn't specify. So you could still be a young earth creationist and hold to the prophetic days view, because it just doesn't tell us how old the earth is. But because it just doesn't tell us, it means that we can be open to what science tells us, and we don't have to be confined to a literal view of Genesis that dates the entire planet and the entire universe as 6,000 years old. So I hope that you've learned tonight that there are multiple ways to look at the text literally, and there are a lot of really literal details that a lot of people have overlooked, even when they proclaim that they take a literal view of Genesis. So I think that the prophetic days view is the best literal interpretation. I think that it is also the easiest to read. I think it's very easy to understand once you've sort of taken off your traditional hat and you kind of open up your mind a little bit to what the text is saying. I think it's very easy to understand that there are parenthetical fulfillment phrases on those days of creation, and that we don't necessarily have to understand them as being fulfilled on the day that they were proclaimed. I dare you to go home and read whatever your favorite version of Genesis is. Now keep in mind things that I've said, like sometimes there are words in English that have been added to the text for clarity's sake that are not actually really helping. So just keep in mind, watch out for those words. Most Bibles today, though, will tell you what those words are if you're paying attention. There will be footnotes, or they'll be put in italics, which means that word is not actually there. It's just there so that the English sounds better. It doesn't sound like a caveman. It sounds like English as we would speak. But I also think that the ancient Hebrews, the audience of Moses, and perhaps even the people before that time, would have also understood the text this way as well. I think that it would have been very clear to them that the proclamations can't be fulfilled in a day, as long as they're reading it carefully also, because clearly, obviously, the Hebrew lay audience could probably read it very quickly and come away with something, very generic. But if they're reading it carefully, I think they can understand that this could potentially be fulfilled over a long period of time, that the text has not told us exactly what it is. So to me, the more you think about the prophetic days view and the more you go over the text, the clearer it becomes, and I think the simpler it becomes to understand. And it presents far less problems, I think, personally, than the young earth view if you go with the long ages with the prophetic days view. So I encourage everybody to look more into that. If you do want to dig deeper into the subject, I highly recommend getting my dad's book, Genesis Science in the Beginning. You can find it here on the Whitfenstock website. And then if you're really interested in seeing some interesting, if you want to hear my dad explain the prophetic days view by itself and not with all these other views thrown in, there's a YouTube video that I have of him presenting at Defenders in 2019 where he explains the prophetic days view in his own words with his own presentation. I think it's a really great presentation. I filmed it myself and edited it myself. So you can listen to that. And then there was one day in Defenders class in 2019 where Dad was present when William Lane Craig discussed the days of divine fiat view or the prophetic days view. And William Lane Craig and my dad went back and forth for a little while during class about the validity of that view. So if you want to see William Lane Craig discussing this view with my dad in person, then you can follow this link here on the Reasonable Faith website, and that video is there as well as the transcript. And Dr. Craig has some interesting things to say about the view. It's not his view, obviously, because he takes a mytho-historical view, which is not a literal view of Genesis. But he does have some interesting things to say. And if you ask Dr. Craig about my dad, he will say that my dad actually opened his eyes to some things that he had never seen before. And Dr. Craig does reference my dad's book in his own book on the historical Adam in one spot. So my dad's book is in the bibliography for Dr. Craig's book, mostly in reference to the word rakia, that means firmament, but which is a subject we didn't really get into tonight, but it's in there, which always makes me very happy when I think about that. And I got Dr. Craig to sign that page of the book for me. But yeah, I hope you can see that this subject for me it invokes a lot of passion in me, because this was my dad's view, and I listened to him talk to a lot of people about it over many years. I listened to him talk to Dr. Craig about it. I listened to him talk to Hugh Ross about it. I was there for the first time that he met Hugh Ross, and it was just the three of us in one room. And Hugh Ross was so gracious to listen to my dad and answer all of his questions. And Hugh Ross endorsed my dad's book, even though it disagrees with his own view. So this to me is a vision of how Christian apologetics should work. People who disagree with each other can still endorse each other because they have the same mission in mind. And that's what Ratio Christi is all about here at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church now. So that's all I've got for tonight. Let me close us out in prayer, and we can be on our merry way. Heavenly Father, I thank you for your magnificence and your artistry, and Lord, the incredible passion that you created our world with. And I thank you, Lord, for all of the beauty that you put in our world and all the wonderful things that you've filled our world with, Lord, on the land and in the sky and on the ground, all the incredible food that you've given us to eat, Lord, and all the incredible sights and sounds that there are for us to experience here. And Lord, we don't overlook your majesty and your grace and your wonder. When we get into the weeds of the text, Lord, I pray that you would help us to reemerge from those weeds, Lord, with an improved wonder and love for you. Lord, I pray that you would always draw us closer to you and help us to know and experience and feel your love deeper. Lord, help us to know you better. Help us to know your Son better. Lord, invoke your Holy Spirit for us to draw us always closer to you, Lord, to help us know you better and to love you more. And Lord, draw us all closer to each other as your body of Christ. And Lord, teach us to trust in you as the head of this body. Lord, I pray that you would unify your church. Help us to recognize the things that are essential and common among us that we can unite and work together for. Lord, I pray that you would help us to love each other more, since they will know us by our love for each other. And I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.